The crows were the first to inherit the field. They descended in a ragged black cloud, their cacophony a victory song for the dead. Below them, the land was a tapestry of crimson and mud, stitched with the broken forms of men and horses. This was Vlad Tepes' masterpiece, his great victory, and as he walked through the carnage, the metallic scent of blood hung so thick in the air it was a fog one drank with every breath. He was a prince, the dragon's son, and his name had been forged in fire and impalement. Yet, standing amidst the ultimate proof of his power, he felt only a yawning emptiness. The screams had faded, the final twitches of life had stilled, and all that remained was the quiet, rotting stillness. His black plate armor was not just spattered but glazed with gore, a second skin of dried violence. The hilt of his sword was slick in his grip. His own thirst was a raging beast in his throat, unquenched by mere water or wine. This thirst was for something more, a final, absolute victory that would not fade with the setting sun. His boot turned over the body of an Ottoman captain, the man's eyes wide with frozen terror. A familiar, grim satisfaction flickered in Vladislav's chest, but it was fleeting, a spark in a vast darkness. It had pushed the enemy back. Yes, it painted the world with their blood. But it was not enough. The world would keep sending its armies, its faiths, its petty kings. Mortality was a chain, and the peace after battle was just the quiet before the next war. He craved a power that was not just feared, but eternal. A dominion that would not end at the edge of a sword, but would stretch into the endless night. As the sun bled out on the horizon, casting long, skeletal shadows from the forest of the impaled, Vlad Tepes made a silent vow to the field of the fallen. This was not an end, it was a beginning. He would drink from a darker cup, or he would drown the world in it. The thirst would be quenched, or it would consume everything. The victory feast in the great hall of Castle Tepes was a hollow pantomime. Before Vladislav, the long oaken table groaned under the weight of roasted boar, dark bread, and flagons of heady wine. His boyars laughed and drank, their faces flushed with relief and spirits. But their cheers sounded distant, muffled, as if he listened from the bottom of a deep well. He raised a heavy silver goblet to his lips, the fine vintage tasting of nothing but ash and dust. It could not cut through the phantom iron temps that had taken root in his soul, the memory of blood steam rising from the fields. His own courtiers recoiled from the look in his eyes. It was not the familiar fire of ambition or the cold steel of command, but a deep, unsettling hunger, a void that seemed to draw the very light from the torches. He found himself staring at the pulsing vein in a minstrel's throat, not with lust, but with a cold, clinical curiosity. The rhythm of life, that fragile beat, was a mystery he now felt compelled to solve by breaking it. The crimson juice of a pomegranate, spilled by a clumsy servant, held his gaze with a terrifying intensity. Looking more vital and real than any wine, sleep became a foreign country. When he closed his eyes, he did not dream, but revisited. He felt the visceral shock of his sword cleaving through mail and bone, saw the light fade from 1,000 eyes, and woke with a jolt, his mouth parched, his body aching for a sustenance he could not name. He drained cup after cup of water, but it was like pouring it onto desert sand, instantly swallowed by a deeper, more profound drought. The thirst was a living thing inside him, coiling around his spine, whispering that only the hot, salt-rich essence of life itself could ever hope to fill the emptiness left by his countless victories. The blood of his enemies was not enough. He needed the power within it, the very secret of existence, and he would wade through an ocean of it to claim that dark, eternal prize. Driven by the ceaseless hunger, Vladislav turned from his court and its meaningless comforts, sought answers in the only place that had ever offered true power, the land itself, in its oldest and most forgotten corners. He left his castle behind, a lone dark figure ascending the treacherous paths of the Carpathians, where the wind carried the scent of pine and ancient secrets. His journey led him to a place shunned by shepherds and hunters, a high plateau where the bones of the earth pierced through the thin soil. Here stood a circle of megaliths, worn smooth by millennia of rain and wind. They were not placed by any hand remembered in the chronicles of men. Their surfaces were carved with spirals and jagged runes that spoke of a time before kings, before gods, when the world was young and ruled by different, hungrier laws. As the moon, pale and bloated, rose over the stone teeth, a change seeped into the air. The wind died, and a profound silence fell, heavy and expectant. It was then that the whispers began. They did not come from the air, but from inside his own skull, a psychic pressure that promised an end to his thirst. They showed him visions not with light, but with feeling, the invigorating rush of 1,000 stolen lives fueling his own, the strength to command the very shadows, the glory of a reign that would never see a sunset. The entity did not speak in words, but in pure, corrosive intent. It was a presence of immense age and limitless appetite, a thing that had slumbered beneath the mountains since the first blood was spilled. It recognized a kindred spirit in Vlad Tepes, a mortal whose capacity for violence and dominion had finally outstripped the fragile vessel of his body. The promise was clear, a seductive poison offered directly into his soul, power over death, an empire of night. All it required was a pact, sealed not with ink, but with a willing sacrifice and an eternal surrender. The thirst that had tormented him now had a source, and it called to him from the darkness between the stars, its voice as cold and compelling as the grave. The entity demanded a token of intent, a sacrifice that would bridge the mortal world and the ancient dark. Vlad descended from the broken stones, his purpose now a cold, sharp clarity in his soul. He moved through the night like a wolf, his senses heightened by the whispers that now coiled permanently in his mind. He found what he sought in a remote monastery, a place of quiet piety, nestled in a wooded valley. Its inhabitants, devoted to a god of light, were the perfect offering to a power of endless night. He did not storm the gates, he simply appeared among them, a specter of black iron and grim purpose. The monks at their vespers had no time to scream before the darkness took them. Vladislav's sword was a blur, a painter's brush staining sanctified walls with profane crimson. It was not a battle, it was a harvest. He moved with an efficiency that was terrifying, each life extinguished not in rage, but as a deliberate, calculated step in a grand ritual. The air grew thick with the smell of incense and copper, a blasphemous perfume for the coming ceremony. When the last of the faithful lay still, Vladislav stood at the center of the carnage. Using the point of his dagger, he carved the same jagged runes from the standing stones into the monastery's cold stone floor, using a mixture of ash and blood as his ink. As the final symbol was completed, the shadows in the room deepened, pooling and congealing into a tangible presence. The air grew frigid. From the coalescing darkness, a form began to take shape, a towering figure of smoke and ancient malice, with eyes that held the chill of the void. No words were exchanged. The pact was an understanding, an offering received. Vlad Tepes knelt not in submission, but in partnership, and the ancient thing reached out a shadowy limb, its touch like ice and fire, sealing the bargain. The price was his humanity. It's the reward, a power that would make the world tremble. The shadow's touch was not a caress, but an invasion. It plunged into Vladislav's chest, a spear of absolute cold that stopped his heart mid-beat. He did not cry out. His body seized, muscles locking as an agony beyond any mortal wound tore through him. This was not the clean cut of a sword. It was the unmaking of a soul. He felt his humanity being scoured away, not layer by layer, but in a single, excruciating rip. The warmth of life, the comfort of breath, the very memory of the sun's warmth on his face, all of it was extinguished. Leaving a vacuum more terrible than the thirst, his body collapsed onto the blood-slicked stone, a puppet with its strings cut. For 3 days and 3 nights, he lay in the charnel house of his own making, a corpse among corpses. The entity's presence was a shroud around him, a cocoon of dark energy, working its will upon his flesh. On the 3rd night, as the moon reached its zenith, a new sensation sparked in the void. It was not the return of life, but the ignition of something else entirely. A raw, predatory power flooded his veins, not with blood, but with a dark, potent energy. His eyes snapped open. The world was not as he remembered it. The darkness of the monastery was now as clear as day, every detail sharp and defined. He could hear the scuttling of insects in the walls, the drip of congealing blood from the altar, the frantic heartbeat of a lone survivor hiding in the crypt below. The thirst that had haunted him was now a roaring conflagration, a command that could not be ignored. He rose, his movements fluid and unnaturally silent. The man, Vlad Tepes, was dead, his mortal ambitions buried. What stood in his place was something new, something ancient, a predator, a Dracula. His first breath as this new being was a long, slow inhalation, taking in the scent of fear and blood, the air of his new kingdom. The hunger was a sovereign now, its command absolute. Dracula moved through the monastery's crypt, a phantom in the suffocating dark, his senses hyperacute, locked onto the frantic rhythm of a single heart, a drumbeat of terror echoing from behind a sealed tomb. With a whisper of movement, he was before it. Stone that would have taken 3 men to shift, he pushed aside as if it were dry kindling. Cowering within was a young novice, his face a mask of tear-streaked grime, his faith shattered by the night's horrors. He looked up at the towering figure, no longer a man, but a creature of sharp angles and burning crimson eyes. A whimper escaped his lips, a final pathetic prayer. Dracula did not lunge. He descended upon the boy with a terrifying grace, one cold hand tilting the head back to expose the vulnerable throat. The novice trembled, his life pulsing visibly beneath the pale skin. There was no rage in the act, only a profound, chilling necessity. Dracula's lips drew back, and the novice saw the fangs in naturally long and sharp instruments of a terrible purpose. The bite was not savage, but precise. A puncture, deep and sure, a gasp, sharp and brief, was the only sound. Then, a warmth flooded Dracula's mouth, rich and potent, a vintage beyond any mortal wine. It was life itself, stolen and consumed. The novice's struggles weakened, his vision dimming as the very essence of his being was siphoned away. The empty goblet of Dracula's being, which water and victory could never fill, was at last being slaked. This was the truth the whispers had promised. This was the only sustenance that mattered. He drank until the heart stuttered and fell silent, then let the empty vessel drop to the cold stone. The thirst was, for a fleeting moment, pacified, and in its place bloomed a new, more terrible understanding. This was not an end, but a beginning. It could not merely take life. He could transform it, command it, and build a legion from its husk. The crimson kiss was not just feeding, it was the first sacrament of his new reign. He returned to his castle not as a returning prince, but as a conqueror taking a foreign land. The dawn was a distant, threatening blush on the horizon, and he moved through its feeble light with a new, profound aversion. A great stone edifice, once a symbol of his mortal power, now felt like a temporary shelter, a cave against the coming sun. He passed through its gates unseen, a ripple of shadow that slipped past guards who felt only a sudden, inexplicable chill. The castle was awake with the routines of the living, but to his heightened senses, it was a cacophony of fragile, pulsing lives. He could hear the scullery maid's heart flutter as she stoked the fire, the steady beat of the captain of the guard on his rounds, the slow, sleepy rhythms of his remaining courtiers. Each one was a candle flame, guttering and weak, and he was the storm. He ascended to his throne room, a vast, cavernous hall where his oaken throne sat upon a dais. It was empty, waiting. He did not sit, stood before it, his back to the approaching day, and felt the castle's rhythm as if it were his own body. The loyalty of these men, the governance of this landit, was all a fleeting mortal game he had transcended. They saw a lord. He now saw cattle and potential servants. The throne itself was a symbol of an authority he no longer recognized. His dominion would not be claimed by sitting on carved wood, but by the spread of eternal night, by the reach of his will. He was no longer the lord of Wallachia. He was the master of this castle, its new, dark heart, and soon it would be the cradle of something far greater. The empty throne was not a seat of power, but a relic. His true throne would be built from the bones of his enemies and the fealty of the damned. The purge began not with shouted orders, but in perfect, predatory silence. Dracula moved through the corridors of his own castle like a plague wind, and the day's feeble light died at the windows, choked by an unnatural fog that coiled from the very stones. His first visit was to his chamberlain, a man who had served his family for decades. The old man looked up from his ledgers, his eyes widening not in recognition, but in primal terror at the specter looming over him. There was no word, no accusation, only a flash of movement and the wet tearing sound of a life being cleanly severed. The The blood that sprayed across the parchment was a new kind of ink, signing a decree of a new era. One by one, he sought out the loyal, the pious, strong-willed, those whose humanity posed a threat or whose faith was a potential weapon against him. The captain of the guard died with his hand on his sword hilt, his throat opened before the blade could clear its scabbard. A pious bojar, found kneeling in prayer, was lifted by an invisible force and dashed against the wall with bone-shattering force. The castle became an abattoir of whispered deaths. The few who survived were not the brave, but the cunning, the corrupt, and the utterly broken, those who saw the new power and, in their terror, chose to kneel before it. By midnight, the great hall was filled once more, but this court was a perversion of the last. Pale, trembling figures stood amidst the lingering scent of blood and fog, their eyes downcast. They were a court of the coerced and the damned, their loyalty bought not with gold or honor, but with the stark choice between fealty and a grisly end. Dracula surveyed them from the dais, his throne still empty behind him. He did not need its affirmation. His power was written in the fear on their faces, and the blood still drying on the flagstones. He had not reclaimed his court. He had forged a new one in the crucible of night, a foundation of terror upon which his legion would be built. The conquered will of his court was merely the first ingredient. The true alchemy of his new power required stronger stock. Dracula turned his gaze beyond the castle walls, to the prisons teeming with the dregs of humanity, murderers, thieves, and traitors. They were dragged from their cells in chains, a procession of the damned shuffling into the castle's main courtyard. Their faces etched with confusion and fear under the light of a gibbous moon. They were forced to their knees in a semicircle before the dais where Dracula stood, a figure of absolute darkness against the torchlight. He did not address them. He simply extended a hand, and from the shadows, a dozen of his most broken courtiers emerged, their eyes gleaming with a reflected hunger. They were his first disciples, granted a sliver of his power, and they fell upon the prisoners with a ferocity that was both bestial and precise. The courtyard became a charnel ground, but this was not a mere slaughter. As each man fell, his lifeblood pooling on the cold stone, Dracula exerted his will. He spoke a single guttural word that was not a word, but a vibration of pure anti-life. A command that resonated in the very air. The blood on the ground began to steam and writhe. Tendrils of crimson mist snaking from the corpses and into the mouths and wounds of the fallen. The dead twitched. Limbs, broken moments before, snapped back into place with sickening cracks. Eyes, wide with the finality of death, flickered open, now burning with the same hellish crimson light that burned in Dracula's own. Where 100 criminals had knelt, 100 soldiers now stood. They were no longer men, but vessels of a shared, dark vitality. They did not cheer or shout. They stood in perfect, unnerving silence, their faces pale and severe, their bodies humming with a speed and strength they had never known in life. They were bound to him, their wills shackled to his own. The sanguine legion was born, not trained, its baptism one of blood and dark miracle. They were an extension of his thirst, and he would unleash them upon the world. The world could not long ignore the blight festering in the Carpathians. Whispers of a dead prince and a vanishing peasantry coalesced into a unified cry for holy war. From the west, a new army marched, but it was not the vast logistical horde of the Ottomans. This was a crusade, a compact, zealous force of knights. And men at arms, their banners bearing the cross, their wagons laden not just with supplies, but with relics and faith. They were clad in polished steel that reflected the sun, their weapons were inlaid with silver, blessed by bishops who spoke of a demonic infestation that needed purging. Their arrival was a blade of light cutting into Dracula's domain. They did not march on his castle directly. Instead, they began a methodical, brutal cleansing of the countryside, hunting the nocturnal patrols of the Sanguine Legion. The first major clash occurred at a mountain pass at high noon. The vampires, invincible in the night, found themselves exposed and weakened under the direct sun. Their preternatural speed was hampered, their senses dulled. The Crusaders, their shields, forming a wall of reflected daylight, met them with disciplined ranks and prayers that seemed to burn the very air. Silvered swords, which should have glanced off flesh, bit deep into the Legion's soldiers, their touch causing wounds that smoked and refused to heal. Holy water sizzled on their skin like acid. For the first time, the Legion knew fear. They were pushed back, their forms dissolving into mist and shadow to escape the searing light, leaving behind a handful of their kind who were too slow, pinned to the ground with silver-tipped stakes. The Crusaders, emboldened by this victory, saw that the monster could be hurt. Their resolve hardened into a cold, righteous fury. They had drawn first blood, and now they turned their faces and their silver toward the heart of the darkness, the brooding silhouette of the Carpathian keep. The siege was coming. The crusade of sun and silver laid siege to the castle as the sun reached its zenith, their faith a tangible force against the stone. They advanced behind a wall of polished shields that cast back the light, their chants and prayers creating a barrier that stung the eyes of the creatures watching from the battlements. Catapults loaded not with stone but with bundles of sacred herbs and splintered relics hurled their payloads over the walls, filling the courtyards with a smoldering, sanctified smoke that choked the undead. From his tower, Dracula watched their progress, a cold fury building within him. This was not a battle for land, but a war of essences, their holy light against his profane dark. He would not cower behind his walls. As twilight began to bleed the light from the sky, he gave the command. The gates of the keep did not open, exploded outward, shattered from within by a tide of feral, recently turned peasants. Their transformation crude and agonizing, driven mad by the thirst. They were a wave of flesh and fury, meant to break the Crusaders' lines and soak their silver in cheap blood. And behind them came the true Sanguine Legion. They flowed over the walls like black water, descending upon the besiegers with the silent grace of predators. The battle was a chaos of shattering light and consuming shadow. A crusader would drive a silvered sword through a vampire's heart, only to be torn from his saddle by two more. A knight, swinging a blessed mace, would see his target dissolve into a flock of shrieking bats. The air grew thick with the smell of incense, blood, and the ozone tang of extinguished magic. Dracula himself strode into the fray, a whirlwind of darkness, his mere presence dimming the torches and snuffing out the holy fervor in men's hearts. He was not a general directing troops. He was a force of nature, and the battlefield was his killing floor. The siege was no longer an attack on a fortress, but a brutal close-quarter slaughter as night, his true ally, finally fell. Victory for the Sanguine Legion was a hair's breadth away. The Crusaders' lines were broken, their holy fire guttering out in the face of the relentless nocturnal assault. Dracula stood atop a mound of the slain, a dark king surveying his crumbling enemies, the intoxicating scent of their fear and blood a symphony in the air. It was in this moment of triumph that the blow fell, not from a Crusader's sword, but from the shadows at his back. His most trusted lieutenant, a boyar named Valerian, whose loyalty had been bought with the promise of eternity during the purge of the court, saw not victory, but opportunity. He had watched Dracula's power grow, had felt the sting of his absolute command, and a seed of resentment, nurtured in secret, had finally sprouted. As Dracula raised his arms to command the final crushing advance, Valerian moved. He did not wield a common blade, but a dagger forged from a fragment of the very standing stones where the pact was made, its edge seeming to drink the moonlight. With the perfect, preternatural speed granted by his master, he lunged. The stone, ancient and indifferent to the powers it had bestowed, slid between Dracula's shoulder blades with a sickening whisper, seeking the dark heart that powered his immortal form. A shockwave of pure agony erupted through Dracula. It was not the pain of a wound, but the violation of his very essence. He roared, a sound that cracked the stone at his feet and stilled the battle around him. He turned, his crimson eyes wide with a betrayal more profound than any mortal could conceive. Valerian met his gaze for a single, triumphant moment before dissolving into a mist, fleeing into the chaotic night. The Sanguine Legion faltered. Their masters were momentarily shattered. The Crusaders, sensing the shift, found a last reservoir of strength. The victory that had been certain was now bathed in the cold, stark light of treachery. The ancient stone dagger did not kill Dracula, but it unmade him. As he staggered back from the battlefield, the wound in his back festered not with infection but with a creeping glacial cold. The potent blood of his victims, which had always fueled his power, now seemed to slip through his veins like ash, He retreated to the deepest, most lightless crypt of his castle, the Sanguine Legion forming a silent, protective cordon around him, their connection to him a thin, fraying thread. Here, in the absolute dark, the true price of his pact was laid bare. The entity he had bargained with was not a mere power source. It was a parasite, and his immortality was its sustenance. The betrayal had created a crack in his will, and through that crack, the ancient thing now poured its essence not to heal, but to claim. Visions assailed him, not of future conquest, but of an eternity not as a ruler, but as a vessel. He saw himself as a rootless, eternal hunger, force of nature with no memory of the man he had been, a storm that would eventually consume even its own legion. His thirst became a torment, a screaming void that could never be filled, only fed. The warmth of blood was a fleeting mockery, a taste of the mortality he had sacrificed. He saw the faces of all he had slain, not in accusation, but in envy. Their suffering had ended. His was a loop, forever spinning on the axis of his own damnation. The power to command the night, the strength to shatter armies, it was all a gilded cage. The crown he sought would be a band of thorns, the throne a slab of cold stone in an endless, sunless hall. Immortality was not victory, it was a sentence, and in that moment of horrific clarity, trapped between the agony of the wound and the veracity of the thing inside him, Vlad Tepes understood the full, monstrous cost of his ambition. From the depths of his torment, a new resolve was forged, not of a man, but of the monster he had become. The price was paid, the contract sealed in his soul. To rail against it was futile. The only path left was to embrace the damnation and make it his own. He would not be a vessel for the ancient thing. He would be its master. He would not suffer the thirst. He would wield it as a king wields a scepter. The crown of eternal night would not be a symbol of light denied, but of a darkness rightfully claimed. Arose from the crypt, the glacial agony of the wound hardening into a core of absolute zero at his center. The Sanguine Legion felt the shift instantly, their frayed connections snapping taut with a new, terrifying authority. Dracula did not call for them. His will became a wave of compulsion that swept through the castle and out into the night. Every vampire, every creature of shadow he had created stopped what they were doing and turned as one toward their master. He ascended to the highest peak of his castle, the wind whipping at his cloak. Below, the remnants of the crusading army were regrouping, their campfires tiny, defiant sparks in the vast Carpathian darkness. Dracula raised his hands, not in a gesture of magic, but of ownership. He drew upon the ancient thing within him, not as a supplicant, but as a warden commanding his most terrible weapon. The clear night sky began to curdle. Clouds, black and heavy, boiled forth from nothing, smothering the stars and the moon. A deep, unnatural twilight fell, not just over the castle, but over the entire land as far as the eye could see. The sun would not rise on this kingdom tomorrow. This was his coronation. The land itself was his throne, and the unending night was his crown. He had not just accepted the darkness, he had summoned it, and it obeyed. The world adjusted to its new, perpetual twilight. Sun became a memory, a faded myth of a warmth that no longer existed. Under the crown of eternal night, Dracula's reign began in earnest. The Sanguine Legion, their numbers replenished from the ranks of the conquered crusaders and the surrounding villages, swept out from the Carpathians like a tide of locusts. They were no longer mere soldiers. They were a pestilence, an extension of their master's will. Towns that did not swear fealty were found empty at dawn. Their populations vanished, leaving behind only a chilling silence and the occasional telltale stain. From his throne of obsidian, carved from the heart of the mountain, Dracula ruled. The mortal court was a distant, meaningless concept. His court was now the Legion itself. His subjects were the terrified whispers of mankind huddled around their guttering fires. The man, Vlad Tepes, was a ghost, a faded portrait in a forgotten hall. The dragon was all that remained. His legend grew, a dark fairy tale to frighten children and sober kings. He was the shadow in the corner of the eye, the reason the nights grew colder, the name spoken only in prayers for protection. He had sought a victory that would not fade, and he had achieved it. He had craved a power that was eternal, and he had consumed it. The thirst was now the rhythm of the world, and the blood was its tribute. The reign of the dragon was not a chapter in history, but its end. It was the beginning of an endless, silent scream in the dark, a kingdom of dust and echoes ruled by an emperor of bones. He had won. And in the profound, sunless silence of his victory, there was only the eternal, hungry dark.